course, this week, I will be, covering mostly the Age of Napoleon, probably its aftermath as well in Europe. So primarily, it's like a two-part lecture series, of course. So we'll talk about, the Age of Napoleon. Like we've kind of talked a little bit about the rise of Napoleon already at this point. But of course, I'll go more into detail on that, especially his early military career that leads into him, being able to seize power eventually, in the country. So and we have kind of talked about some things about Napoleon. I think we kind of went into how Napoleon kind of came to power at the end of the Directory, like the Directory government that had, taken power at that point. I did kind of go into some of his early life, how he was born on the island of Corsica. Remember, he's Italian background, the little corporal. And then eventually, as you know, he went to schools in France. I think I told you he went to that famous École Militaire, which is the French academy, of military academy of the Bourbons, where he graduated second lieutenant, and then from there, his career took off pretty much successful, and he became a general, by the way, at a very, very young age. I think he was in his 20s, 24, I think, when he became a general, just pretty young for that time period. So, of course, Napoleon, like I said, rose during the French Revolutionary Wars. That's what made Napoleon great, because he was one of their best generals, pretty much. And I think we talked about the fact that he was this military genius that people kind of still study today. Like they study all of his tactics. They study all the battles that he fought in. Like the Battle of Austerlitz, I'll get to later, was considered really one of his best victories as a commander during the war. So he had a pretty lengthy military career, which was something like 20, 30 years. And I think I told you he was almost undefeated. I think he had almost like an 80, 90% winning percentage as a general, which is, I think, the greatest in history. I think I kind of compared it to Nick Saban. Some people like Nick Saban, I know, but he's kind of like the military generals of Nick Saban. That would be kind of he lost Waterloo, which we'll get to later, of course, but anyway, of course, we'll get to later. He's a political ruler. He's known for his reforms to France in Europe. And then later, he's also known for, of course, becoming Emperor of France in 1804, which he was for 10 or 11 years. So let me get more into the early life. I think we were kind of talking about some of the things that he was kind of known for in his career, which you can see. Kind of expand that and look at that. But I think I kind of talked about some of those early things there you're looking at right there. The first three we're looking at. But there's a few things that made him kind of well known. One was the Battle of Toulon, which was during the French Revolutionary Wars in 1793. And that battle took place, I think, in the winter, 1790, November, December. It was a battle where what happened was the British had come in. They seized the port of Toulon with their navy. And so the French were trying to figure a way to get them out. So Napoleon came up with this idea to seize a hill that was up above the harbor and then laying cannon at the ships. And so he did that. And of course, that forced the British to evacuate their forces. And so the French were able to retake the city of Toulon, basically. I think he was a captain at the time when this happened. Then from there, he went from captain to brigadier general. So he was 24 years old when that happened, when he, of course, became like a general. It's pretty young, at that point. Then the other thing he's known for, too, later, he didn't have any commands at that point. I think he was just like a general that was kind of controlling the army of the interior, I think, in France. And in October 1795, the Directory was working on its constitutional convention, to create a new constitution for France, for the French Republic. And anyway, royalists were threatening to basically storm it, seize control. And so apparently Napoleon was the only general that was in Paris that could, deal with the mobs And so he came up with the idea to use cannon again, but against the mobs, like the royalists that were trying to storm it, basically. I think some historian once remarked later that he used what they call a whip of grape shot, against them. It's a type of canister type cannon they use, of course, and killed a bunch of them and basically saved the directory. But I think I've told you before that Napoleon, part of why he was so successful was because of his wife. Remember, his first wife, Josephine, knew a lot of the members of the directory and people in the society in France and the government. And so she was able to get a lot of Napoleon's early commissions when he fought in as a general, which is true about that. So yeah, they kind of owed himself a lot to his wife, having a lot of connections in general. Of course, the other thing that made Napoleon, he wasn't really famous yet at that point, but what makes him famous is the so-called Italian campaign, where Paul Barras in the Directory government gave Napoleon a commission to take what was a French army that was trying to fight Italy, like in the Alps in northern Italy at the time. And anyway, this army was like a ragtag. It was like just terrible. And when he gets there, all the officers make fun of him because it's to say, oh, he's the general that owes his commission because of his wife, was the joke. But they start finding out that Napoleon's a pretty good general, and so he's able to revitalize this army and then, cross through the Alps. They eventually, of course, fight against Austrian forces and also Sardinia, or what they call Piedmont, Sardinia, as well. And at that time, what was going on was the French Republic was being opposed by what they call the First Coalition. They often call it the War of the First Coalition. But you can see that included a lot of countries that were basically against, France, the Dutch Republic, British Empire, Holy Roman Empire in Austria, Prussia, Sardinia, Piedmont, or Sardinia, of course, they called it in northern Italy, northwestern Italy. It's also, of course, allied with, I guess, them as Austria as well. And anyway, they didn't know what to think of Napoleon. No, his tactics were ridiculous. He would attack, pretty much, at night. He would attack them, if it was wintertime, if it was raining, it didn't matter. If the other general thought he was in check, he thought he was back off, right? Well, he'd just come at him. That's what he would do. So Napoleon was like a new kind of general that nobody had ever seen before. Well, they kind of went after the enemy and didn't stop until he, crushed them. And so Napoleon's greatest battle in that Italian campaign was the Battle of Lodi on May 10th, 1796. That was a battle. It was kind of a minor battle where it was like, it was kind of in northern Italy, across a river, and this force had to actually cross a bridge to actually take the city. And those Austrians were like, "Yeah, not going to do that." And they did. They stormed the bridge, took the city, and of course, Napoleon became a household name after that. His troops started calling him like the Little Corporal right after the Battle of Lodi. And of course, the name stuck after that. And so Napoleon starts thinking that he's better than everybody else, which he kind of was, for a long time. And he's unbeatable. Like nobody could beat Napoleon for, luckily pretty much about 10, 15 years. He's unbeatable probably till 1812, 1813, in battle. So, he thinks he's lucky, like a lucky star. Somebody's, kind of looking after him, pretty much with that. Also, he actually himself signs basically a treaty with the Austrians, the Treaty of Campo Formio. He actually I think he invaded Austria halfway to like Vienna. They basically were forced to basically sue for peace with him. And so that caused the so-called First Coalition to actually collapse at that point. And the French start taking over northern Italy. They'll control it for a bunch of years after that. When Napoleon eventually takes over France. And later, Napoleon will take the northern part of Italy and he'll form a kingdom out of it, which is called sometimes the kingdom. It was called the Kingdom of Italy, is what he called it. And I think later he had a title, if you know about it, which was called King of Rome. It was one of his titles that he went by. So that's basically the so-called Italian campaign, like I said, that made Napoleon like a household name. Everybody knew who Napoleon was. And of course, in Europe, they started, also talking about Napoleon as well. Now, one of the strangest careers, like in the whole thing with Napoleon's military campaigns, whatever, was his Egyptian campaign that happened, I guess, roughly between 1798 to about 1800 is about when it was. And it was part of a war. They call it the War of the Second Coalition. So another coalition formed again after the first one broke up. This one included Britain in it with a bunch of those other same kind of countries that I talked about before. I think most of them are in there. Though Spain starts dropping out and supporting the French. We'll get that later. But the French believed that if they could somehow, cut off Britain's trade routes to the east, like India, which of course the British were getting into in the 18th century, they thought that basically that would, force them to get out of the war. They would want to sue for peace with the French Republic at the time. So you have the so-called Egyptian campaign that followed, 1798 to 1800, where Napoleon's forces eventually invaded Egypt in the summer of 1798. They fought against what was basically territories that were controlled by the Ottoman Empire. They mostly fought in Egypt, in what is really Israel, which they used to call Syria back in those days. But they fought actually against not the Ottomans, but these mercenaries of the Ottomans that were called the Mamluks, which you may have heard of, which were kind of a mix of different peoples in the Middle East, so-called Mamluks. And the Mamluks their military was really not that good. They relied too much on cavalry with lances and things like that. And so they weren't as advanced as European-type military forces in their weaponry, that the Napoleons brought in, of course, to Egypt. It's believed that in June of 1798, Napoleon's forces landed in Egypt, maybe like 40,000 troops, may have been how large of a force that Napoleon brought with his French Navy. And his forces easily overwhelmed the Mamluks. You can see the so-called Battle of the Pyramids. That was like really the only major battle they fought really in Egypt, which was fought, you can see, on July 21st, 1798. And French forces just totally destroyed the Mamluk force there with minimal casualties, like very few casualties in the battle. They couldn't basically counter like Napoleon's musketry and, of course, their cannon. And Napoleon also formed their units into squares, which were, good defensive squares, which were good against cavalry. This is what happened at Waterloo. Of course, the British used as well. But with that, the French were able to take control of Egypt. And, of course, after that, they began trying to make kind of reforms to Egypt and trying to modernize it more like the French state in Europe. And then, of course, the other thing they talk about Napoleon, which is well known, if you know about this, was that Napoleon brought in people like scientists, they brought in historians, artists, and other peoples to study ancient Egypt, like ancient, the Egyptian culture, Egyptology. And it's believed that Napoleon, his influences when he went into Egypt helped start modern Egyptology, or at least popularize the idea of studying about Egypt. Because I think under him at the time, they began to study like the Sphinx. You see there in the picture, they studied the Great Pyramid. I think they even calculated, the French when they were there, how many stones were in the Great Pyramid, which I think was like 2.3 million stone blocks or something like that. You may have heard about this thing they found, of course, when they were there. I believe I've got a picture. I don't have a picture of it, but I got a slide on it, which is the so-called Rosetta Stone. They found that, of course, in 1799. It was discovered in the Delta area of the Nile, actually in a fort in Egypt. It was found by the soldier named Pierre Francois Bouchard. he discovered it. And it was this black basalt stone that weighed about half a ton, like maybe 1,000 pounds. And they pulled it out of a wall. And anyway, it was had an inscription on it, which was from the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, one of the Ptolemy kings. And it talked about him being coronated, like one of the kings being crowned. And what they found out about it, of course, was that it was important later because the fact that it would lead to the rediscovery of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. It would be like the, I guess, decipher key or decipher stone. I'm going to call it that, I guess. and anyway, within a few years after they discovered it, like maybe 20 years or whatever, this Frenchman named Jean-Francois Champollion was the first to actually translate it. Rosetta Stone, I think in 22, I think is when he translated it. And he got a copy of it. But if you know about it, the actual stone itself ended up in the British Museum in London. And by the way, the Egyptians aren't happy about that. They, of course, want the Rosetta Stone back. If you know about that, they want a lot of things back that the British have. British have a lot of stuff that they won't give back. You know about that to different peoples, different countries. It's just kind of well known. You know, we've talked about that before in other lectures as well. So it's kind of controversial, you know, with that. But that is important. I think without the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, they wouldn't know hardly anything about Egypt except from whatever they get from archaeology. They wouldn't even know the names of the kings and all that. So it's kind of important. Now, the only thing about Napoleon, he's in Egypt, but if you know what happens, I'll come back to it. I don't think I've got this little slide right here about this, but Napoleon's forces get trapped in Egypt, which is true. Apparently in 1798, I think it's early August, the British Navy come into what is the Nile Delta, where they have what they call Aboukir Bay. That's there. And what happens, his French fleet gets attacked by the British Navy. And it's led by this guy named Horatio Nelson, who you see a picture of. They call him also Lord Nelson, considered one of the greatest naval commanders in British history, like the best in pretty much, you know, the Napoleonic Wars. And anyway, his whole fleet, most of it gets destroyed in a couple days. They call it the Battle of the Nile, or some people call it the Battle of Aboukir Bay as well. And so, yeah, it leaves him trapped, pretty much his forces in Egypt. He's unable to go back, you know, to France at that point. And so he basically, you know, Napoleon's forced to, you know, have to, you know, stay in Egypt and basically bake his own bread and all that, you know. So he's really got to deal with that issue. He's not able to be supplied till later, you know, or even have ships come in later, which is really a big problem, you know. Well, you know what Napoleon does do? 1799, he actually takes his forces up into Syria, where Israel is, attacks it, and seizes control of Gaza, you know, which is on the Mediterranean Sea there, next to Israel, now part of Palestine. He also takes Jaffa and Haifa, which are in the northern part of Israel as well. And I don't know if you know about Napoleon, but Napoleon had this idea to create a Jewish state. He was actually one of the first to think about it, like in modern times. Anyway, this is where, I guess, the idea of Jewish nationalism becomes popular in the late 1800s. But he had this idea to do that. But his troops got riddled with bubonic plague. Yeah, they still had bubonic plague at that time. And so they were kind of forced to retreat back to Egypt. And so they were unable to basically complete his conquest. He wanted to go in to take over Israel and Syria, conquer that also. Eventually, by the end of 1799, Napoleon is going to return to France, which he will, like maybe October, November. He's pretty much back and in control, you know, as what he first take over. And he returns a hero, even though his forces really were kind of starting to get beat, because most of his forces will eventually be overwhelmed by the British and the Turks, you know, later. But he's a hero. He's a hero of France. He does use propaganda a lot to kind of, you know, make himself better than he was. If you know about Napoleon, Napoleon later, when he would seize power, used a lot of censorship in the newspapers. He also had secret polices that he had. Like, you may have heard of Joseph Fouché, who was head of the French secret police. And so it was kind of like, something you see later, like in Russia, the kind of secret police that they had, under him. And what's going to happen is he's going to conspire with basically the directory, like members of it that are in it, and also people in the military to eventually seize control. And so what happens in kind of like early November 9th, I think is usually considered the date, Napoleon's going to eventually seize power in what they call the coup of 18 Brumaire. That's usually the French nickname, what they called it, because they were still using that old French Republican calendar that we talked about before. Brumaire was what they called October or November at the time. And so he used that to take control of the state. It's kind of like a military coup is what it amounts to. And so that's going to eventually lead to the beginning of the so-called Age of Napoleon that'll follow. Pretty much also, another thing it does too is that it ends the French Revolution, which is true about that. It pretty much comes to an end. And so it kind of signals the end of the revolution, which lasted about 10 years, roughly. And Napoleon remarked later, I think when he was getting crowned emperor in 1804, that he once said that I am the revolution. So it was kind of like the evolution or culmination of what happened in France. And I liked how in that little short video, he said that basically I picked the crown out of the gutter and I put it on my head. Like nobody had it, so I guess I got it now. So that's interesting about that, how Napoleon was able to take power. Of course, a lot of people had a negative view about, when he did, seize power. They usually refer to the period under Napoleon, like when he first comes in. If you know about the period of Napoleon, it's first divided into two periods. You've got the first period, which is called the Consulate. So they usually do from 1799 to about around 1804. And the Consulate was like a Republican French government where Napoleon was in control. You'll notice the term consul being used, which you can see that was kind of a Roman influence. The ancient Romans had the so-called consuls that ran things. So it's this idea of having this chief magistrate that ran the state. There were actually three consuls. There was a first consul, a second consul, and a third consul. So instead of 5 rulers, you got 3, like you had under the directory. However, the other 2 guys didn't have any power, like the other 2 consuls. And he's basically kind of like a dictatorship is what kind of people were starting to kind of view it as, backed by the military. So that's kind of the view of everybody when he comes in. Some people aren't happy about it. They think he's this dictator. Of course, later when he's crowned as emperor of France, a lot of people don't think he's legitimate, especially because he's not from nobility. So that's something that's kind of controversial, of course, at the time. Now, Napoleon is known for something he did do, when he did come in power. He's kind of this enlightened figure that was kind of seen as a reformer. He was known for a lot of his reforms to the French state, which had, hadn't really been done before much. So he reformed it, and a lot of them were based on, like I said, the French Revolution. A lot of them were based off the Age of Enlightenment. So like I say, he's a man of the Enlightenment. In of course, examples of things that he was known for doing with his reforms. He created a national bank, something the French didn't really have before, or at least they didn't have one that was successful before that they had, which was created in 1800. And so that was important. It's mostly founded by Swiss bankers, by the way, the bank that he set up. And a lot of it was set up to bankroll his power and, control over France. And I think it helped stabilize the economy and stabilize the French currency, create less inflation and things like that in the country. He also restored the Catholic Church, which he eventually got rid of that cult of the Supreme Being, I think by 1802, where he had this deal he made with the Catholic Church. Pope Pius VII at the time, he was the Pope, so-called Concordat of 1801 that you can see. And so Napoleon allowed the Catholic Church to actually come back. But I think under the church, like the Catholic Church in France, the priests or whatever still had to take an oath to the state. So instead of like Rome or whatever, under the Concordat of 1801, they would have religious freedom. So anybody could practice, their religion. Napoleon was never really a big religious person. He was Catholic, but I think because of what happened, maybe when they had all that stuff with the Jacobins and so on, he wasn't really big into religion. In fact, he looked into other religions too and thought that like Judaism, Islam were just as good as the Christian faith. Yeah. He actually wrote to the Jews and all that about whether they would support it, etc. So anyway, so those are some reforms. Of course, the most famous thing that Napoleon did, if you know about it, was he created the Napoleonic Code, also called the Code Napoleon or Civil Code of 1804. It was a French civil law code system that was developed by jurists under him. It was developed over several years, mostly, of course, when he was first consul. And it was heavily influenced by ideas in the French Revolution, but also by the Age of Enlightenment. So like ideas of equality, freedom of religion, all went into it. Also, it was based off of the Justinian Code. A lot of modern law codes were heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire's Justinian Code. It's been around, and so that's kind of interesting about that as well. About in Louisiana, our law code system is heavily influenced by the Napoleonic Code. It's part of why if you take the bar, it's more difficult. It's not like other states. It's not as influenced by, of course, his law code system that he helped develop. Also, Napoleon created, I'll kind of mention this too, but he also created education reforms, especially for boys in France. They created these schools called lycées, which I think must be still out in France today, I guess they have, where they educated Frenchmen from the age of 10 to 16. That's something they were known for. And I guess after that, you had to go to the military. Pretty much everybody else did it. Because it was a military society, pretty much under Napoleon. So he was known for that. Kind of like the Germans had the gymnasium or whatever, all this other different kinds of, schools they had. Kind of similar to that as well. Of course, the metric system. I usually mention that they kind of developed it in Europe. The metric system, if you know about that, which replaced the British imperial system. But Napoleon actually didn't really like it, but he spread it like everywhere he went. Conquered parts of Europe. He spread the idea of the metric system. So that's how it got spread all over Europe because of his conquests, etc. I think under the metric system, he may have been maybe shorter. I don't know. I forget which it was. I forget. I think maybe the British pound, I thought he was like 5'2" or something. So I don't know. I'm not sure about that. It's kind of funny. But you may have heard of this, the Legion of Honor. That's something he developed, which is still around today in France, which is this French merit system, which honors like soldiers, civilians that have done great for the state in general. It's kind of honoring them as people. And it replaced like a lot of the things like nobility and titles. It's kind of, I think, the whole point of why they created the whole Legion of Honor, I guess, originally. And but it had 5 ranks to it, which Grand Master was the highest rank that you could obtain, which would be like Emperor, obviously, or now President of France is the Grand Master. You got rewards. They also got medals as well. And wherever the Grand Master is, of course, we'll get what they call the Grand Cross, which is the typical type of medal that you usually would wear, which the President of France would wear. And of course, Napoleon was one of the first to wear it. Trying to think if I have one of Napoleon with it. I'm not sure if I have it. Here's one, I think, maybe with him wearing it right here. There's the Grand Cross on the left side of his kind of shirt there. So that's basically, his uniform there. That's what they call the Grand Cross. So Napoleon, was this, reformer, political reformer, but he was also, considered to be not just that, but a great, great military leader who, of course, influenced, military history and things like that and tactics overall. Now, the next thing happened, of course, after that, Napoleon, went from being first consul. I think in 1802, they made him consul for life. It was one of the things that they did. I think at first it was supposed to be maybe 10 years, and then they made it for life. But eventually what happened was in 1804, Napoleon went further, of course, and as you know, he became Emperor of France, December 2nd, 1804, where he was crowned in Notre Dame Cathedral. And so they believe this will eventually start a new period as part of the Age of Napoleon, which they call later different names. Napoleonic Empire or the Empire of Napoleon is the common nicknames, of course, that they'll often call it. And it had different names, like the French Empire that he founded was also called like the First French Empire. That's the common name that they usually called it, because there is a second one later that they have that's founded in 1848 by his nephew, which is Napoleon III. I'll get to him later. And it'll be around to like 70, I believe. So that's why they call it the first and the second, French empires, not to confuse the two together. Napoleon didn't call it that. He called it the Grand Empire, which meant great empire. And he called everything that, his great army or Grand Army, and so on. So he basically had those kind of names that he would often use, of course, to describe that. So, of course, if you know about, Napoleon, one of the things that he's famous for when he was crowned emperor in 1804 was he crowned himself, about this, and then he became famous for crowning his wife. And he crowned himself emperor, and he crowned his wife empress, because I think usually they would have some kind of religious figure like the Pope or somebody that would come and crown the ruler. And I think there was a ceremony where supposedly the Pope was going to put the crown on his head, and people joked about the fact that he grabbed it from him and put it on his own head, but that was all planned. He was going to crown himself. So I guess that's saying that, I'm not really anybody that's like nobility. I'm just this average guy, this guy that rose up from, nobody, and now I'm the ruler, so. And he does kind of see himself as this, like a Caesar, or maybe like a Augustus, or one of those kind of rulers in the past that you've heard about previously, maybe like Constantine the Great or something like that. I don't know, any kind of Roman type figure, So he's kind of trying to style himself as this Caesar of Europe, and so a lot of people kind of are turned off by that. Sometimes, like in parts of Europe, and they start to think he's this emperor that's a tyrant, that's kind of taken over. So what's going to happen, I'm going to get to it, of course, next, which is, of course, the fact that Napoleon's seizure of power in Europe is going to spark the Napoleonic Wars. The British, other powers, don't see him as legitimate. They even want to put the Bourbons back on the throne. In France, there's talk of that. Of course, it sparks really a series of conflicts which last, you can see, over 10 years, 1803 to 1815. It actually spawned something like 4 coalitions, I think, at one point that fight against Napoleon's forces. And it's all the same kind of powers, but the ones that were like the ones that really kind of opposed him the most were the big ones, like Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Holy Roman Empire, and Austria, kind of similar with the Swedes. So those are all your powers that really opposed them. Spain was kind of like wavering. They were kind of going back and forth. And Spain actually for a while supported the Napoleon until he attacked them, of course, which I'll talk about later. But it would end up causing like 3 million deaths, like over 3 million were killed in the war. It's the bloodiest conflict that happened in the 19th century. The 1800s was the Napoleonic Wars. You got to really go back before this war. I know the 7 Years' War, I think they had 1.5 million, I think, killed in that war, which is in the 18th century, but you got to go all the way back to really the 30 Years' War, to a war that was bloodier. And then really, it's not really you don't really get an even more bloodier war until World War One, where World War One, it was like almost 9 million soldiers died in that war, just to give you kind of a comparison between those two conflicts. I think the only conflict that comes close to being bloody in the 1800s would be the American Civil War, where I think close to 1 million must have died in that one, or almost, on both sides. So I don't think it was quite that, but it was pretty much up there. So now Napoleon, one thing about his power, of course, if you know about it, Napoleon's going to eventually amass an army to fight the different coalitions during these wars. And he forms what they call the Grand Army, which I talked about, the Great Army of Napoleon, which they think he formed it in 1805 is the year. And they believe this army was, by the way, one of the greatest armies in Europe up to modern times. I think it amassed at one point maybe 800,000 troops, which were based in France and parts of Western Central Europe. And he used this army, by the way, to practically almost conquer Europe. Like really the greatest conqueror later that'll kind of be, I guess, emulated with him will be Adolf Hitler. There's going to be really no other man after him that'll conquer more territory, which Hitler almost conquered all of Europe, just about, except he couldn't defeat the British and the Soviets. If he would have done that, he would probably conquer the whole thing eventually. They do think that this army was unbeatable for something like, I want to say 8 years. They couldn't beat it. If you know about that in Europe. Their cannon, like their artillery, was awesome. That was one thing about the French. They had great artillery, which would obliterate their enemies. Their musketry, not so well. Musketry were not that accurate back in those days. You had to really get up close to really cause any havoc with musketry. But cannon, that was the key in a lot of his battles. And part of why he was able to build the Grand Army was because of Louisiana. If you know about it, in 1800, Napoleon actually bought Louisiana from the Spanish, took it back from them. And he had this ambition where he was going to basically invade North America. He was going to conquer that, take out the British, because, the British still controlled parts of Canada at the time. I think part of where Louisiana is, I think controlled, close to where British Florida is, right there as well. So he had this ambition to basically take it over. But if you know what happened, Haiti, they had the Haitian Revolution broke out. He lost the Isle of Haiti, which he would use as a base, to attack into, North America. So he decided that was useless. And so in 1803, if you know about it, he sold it to the United States for $15 million. You can see there, so-called Louisiana Purchase. And Thomas Jefferson, was president at the time, and he bought it. So it's greatest land purchase probably in history. I think it was like 20 cents an acre or something like that is what it was. And so the United States doubles its size. And he would kind of be, I think, more supportive of, the United States over the British, which is true about that. We even tried to trade with him also, during the Napoleonic Wars, et cetera. So like I said, Napoleon's armies, like I said, Hitler, are going to conquer most of Europe. He's going to conquer, actually, at one point, Spain, Portugal. He's got control of, the area around the Netherlands and all that. North parts of Italy, take over parts of Germany, Poland, and even will invade into parts of Western Russia. So his forces take a lot of territory or control states as satellite states that are kind of forced to be allied with them, of course, during the wars, more or less. He fought multiple coalitions, especially between 1803 and 1807. Napoleon fought 2 series of wars that were called the Wars of the Third Coalition and the War of the Fourth Coalition. And in these wars, he beat decisively, by the way, Austria, Prussia, Russia. All 3 of those were beaten badly, which I'll talk about today. The only state he couldn't beat, if you know about that, was Britain. It's why he lost the Napoleonic Wars. He couldn't take them out. And of course, their navy was just too powerful for them really stop them. So the British naval power really is part of why Britain was able to kind of win the Napoleonic Wars. It's like he had the best armies and they had the best navy. It's kind of like that at the time. Napoleon's I think his only defeat I'll mention about, by the way, was the Battle of Trafalgar. I'll kind of mention about that before I get into some of his other battles that he's more known for winning. But Napoleon had this idea to invade Britain, which he tried to do in 1805. I think it was even this idea where he was going to dig tunnels under like the English Channel, or use balloons, hot air balloons, to actually cross the channel and try to invade, because the British had their navy, and so he conspired with the Spanish in their navy to try and combine their naval forces to attack Britain, maybe invade it. And what happened was it led to the Battle of Trafalgar on October 21st, 1805. And Lord Nelson, again, of course, we talked about him before, he would lead about 27 British naval ships against the French, which had actually more ships. I think they had 33 ships you see there. Nelson's famous for his flagship called the HMS Victory, which is, I think they still got the ship today, like the actual, I think it's now a museum ship in Britain. And anyway, Nelson's forces badly routed the Franco-Spanish fleet, took out like 2/3 of their fleet, but he got killed in the battle. You know about that. He was like mortally wounded, like when a French, I think, musketeer shot him. But that basically, the Battle of Trafalgar, is very important because it prevented Napoleon from really invading Britain. So he basically was forced to attack the other powers instead of going after, of course, the British at that point. That's going to lead into, by the way, of course, a series of battles that are going to be part of the War of the Third Coalition, which I'll talk about today. They got the so-called Battle of Austerlitz, which I'll, of course, mostly go into overall, which you see on the right. Basically with he was unable to invade England, at that point. And so what he does, he takes his Grand Army across the Rhine River and all that, and he goes into Austria. So he attacks them, and he begins what they call the Alm Campaign, which, by the way, only lasted like 3-4 weeks. It was a very short campaign, September to October 1805. He quickly defeats the Austrian forces in something like 3 weeks. It was just a total rout of their forces. And he fought against his, what would be later his future father-in-law, who's Emperor Francis II, because that's the father of Marie Louise, I told you about before, who later marries Napoleon a bunch of years later. But he was the emperor of France. He's also, I'll get to it later, the last Holy Roman Emperor, of course, who's forced to step down. What happens is Napoleon's forces basically traps his main army near what is called Ulm, so-called Battle of Ulm, which is a 3-day battle you can see October that year. And what happens, it eventually leads to the fall of Vienna, which will fall eventually in November. And so after that, Napoleon's practically sleeping in the Schönbrunn Palace. He basically takes it over at that point, takes their capital. What happens after that was that because of the fact that the Austrians' main forces got defeated, the Austrians then looked to the Russians in the east to come in and help them. So you know about it, the Austrians and the Russians formed this military alliance to try and defeat Napoleon, which was led by Emperor Alexander I. Well, you see there was the grandson of Catherine the Great. And so he'll bring in forces to fight, of course, Napoleon. They combined their forces to about close to 95,000 troops. And they eventually engage in early December 2nd, 1805, so-called Battle of Austerlitz, which, by the way, is considered to be one of Napoleon's greatest battles that he fought in. It's now located in the Czech Republic, but at the time it was part of the, I think, northern part of the Austrian Empire, I think around Bohemia, about be where it is. Napoleon had about 70 to 75,000 troops. They had 95,000. So they obviously had him outnumbered in the battle. It does have a name. They call it the Battle of the Three Emperors because all three were emperors. Napoleon's an emperor. I told you Francis is an emperor, and so is Alexander. So they're all emperors. And so that's why they give it that nickname, of course, today. This battle was very decisive, of course. Napoleon, who had a smaller force, was able to rout a larger force. He mostly did it by trickery. If you know about Austerlitz, and one of the things that Napoleon did that's very famous at Austerlitz was he weakened his right flank on purpose and held back forces, knowing that it would be something that was tempting, for the Russians, Austrians to attack that flank and do like an oblique order attack tactic, like we talked about before, which they tried. And when they did that, Napoleon had forces that were hidden behind hills. It was very foggy too that morning. His forces attacked the Russian Austrian forces in the center and cut their army in half. That's what occurred. And he ends up routing most of, like 2/3 of their army was wiped out, either captured or killed and wounded. 16,000 killed and wounded at Austerlitz. 20,000 were actually captured by the French forces. His forces suffered very little casualties compared to what happened, basically, with them. And so that particular battle was considered to be, like I said, Napoleon's greatest. It's like this kind of battle that people still study, like military schools study it today. He later would build the Ark the Triumph, which honored that actual battle, which I think I've got a picture of the Arc de Triomphe, which is in the central part of Paris today, which includes also a tomb of the unknown soldier that's there as well. And he would later have a commission right after he won, kind of like a victory arch, like the Romans had a long time ago. And it was later completed, I think after his death, though. I think it takes a while for them to actually build it and complete it over time. But it does honor, the Battle of Austerlitz, which, of course, Napoleon won decisively. Now, the defeat of Austria did a bunch of things. First of all, it caused the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, which was eventually dissolved in early 1806. Like, I think January of 1806 is when they dissolved it. So remember, Emperor Francis, I talked about, was the last Holy Roman Emperor. He would step down, and then he would just be the Emperor of Austria, is what he would call himself afterwards. He then took part of Austria's territory around the Rhine and Germany, and he created a buffer state between France and Germany, between the two. It was called the Confederation of the Rhine. And Napoleon was very famous for creating all these little states in Europe. And there were some cases where he put his relatives on the thrones, which were kind of like a form of nepotism, including a couple of his brothers, like Jerome and I think Joseph Bonaparte, were actually put on some of the thrones in Europe, which is kind of famous. Austerlitz, by the way, led to a string of Napoleon victories. Like, he just wiped them out in a matter of like a few years. The Grand Army, they're unbeatable. You can see they even go into Spain and Portugal, take that over as well. So they're going to be unbeatable for like 7-8 years. Nobody can really take them out at that point. After he subdued the Austrians, the next thing that happened, of course, was Napoleon. He's going to next go after the Prussians as well. He'll take them out next. The War of the Fourth Coalition, that's what they call it usually, which I guess started in 1806, and it goes to like 1807, 1808. Anyway, Napoleon would go northward, invade into Prussia, where he would fight King William III's armies at two battles, Battle of Jena and also the Battle of Austerlitz, as they kind of combine them together, because were fought on the same day on October 14th. The Prussians, by the way, got beat horribly in that battle. I thought the casualties were just ridiculous in that battle. What were they? I think they, oh, yeah, here it is. Yeah, 28,000 killed and wounded. French only lost 2,500 men. That's it. They're very lopsided battles that these were fought, of course. With that, he then took Berlin, seized the capital of Berlin. And the Prussians, for like the next 5 years, are really just under Napoleon's thumb. He pretty much controls most of Germany after that. And that wasn't it. He kept going. He kept going. In 1807, he would go after the Russians too, under Alexander's forces. So he pushes into East Prussia, into Poland at that point, and he'll eventually defeat the Russians as well. In another pitched battle, June of 1807, you can see Battle of Friedland as well. That battle was lopsided too. That was, I think the Russians suffered 30,000 casualties, French only 8. So you can see how superior that the French are militarily to anybody else, including their artillery, like I said, was pretty much superior. Hey, Kamika, good morning. How you doing out there? Of course. Anyway, now what happened after that? Well, after, and by the way, Friedland, they think now today, like the battlefield itself is actually where Kaliningrad is. It used to be part of like the Soviets, used to control that Soviet Union a long time ago. But it used to be part of Poland, I think, like the northern part of it originally, or in East Prussia. Yeah, Friedland effectively crushed the War of the Fourth Coalition, and they would end up, the Russians would have to sue for peace with Napoleon by July of 1807, called the Peace of Tilsit, or really called the Treaties of Tilsit, is what they usually called it. And the Treaties of Tilsit, what they did was it forced Russia and Prussia to form an alliance with basically Napoleon, his empire. They couldn't be in the coalition that was fighting against Napoleon, the so-called War of the Fourth Coalition, which, like fell apart pretty much after that in 1808. And Britain would end up being like the only country left that was, fighting after that. And so what's going to happen? The Russians are forced into this alliance. They hate it, though. The Russians did not like Napoleon. Like I'll get to Emperor Alexander I. He hated Napoleon's guts. Would later try to get him back, 1812, 1813, as you know, he would help defeat Napoleon later. And Napoleon would also create a bunch of buffer states after he defeated the Russians. He created the Kingdom of Westphalia, which he would put one of his brothers, I think it was Jerome, was the one he put on the Kingdom of Westphalia that he had, which is in Western Germany, I believe it was. Duchy of Warsaw. That was something interesting that Napoleon was like, he wanted to create a Polish state. He thought the Poles need a state, for them nationally. And so he created a state for them also as well. You may have heard of the Free City of Danzig that was around for a long time, up to modern times. He created that city also as well. Something he was kind of known for. So Napoleon at that point, is, like I said, cementing his power over, Europe. And what's going to happen, is that Napoleon's going to, he's going to upset a lot of people, with this. As he's doing this, he's even going to go into Spain. He's going to go into Portugal. I'll talk about the continental system as well. Napoleon's going to create this embargo or blockade of Britain, thinking that that's going to be a way that he can defeat, the British Empire. But it ends up not working. His navy is just not powerful enough to defeat, the British Empire as a whole. I'll talk about it. Even causes the War of 1812, where the United States ends up in a war with the British because of that blockade that he puts. Then, of course, he goes into Spain and Portugal. Like I said, they have that Peninsular War breaks out, which is a guerrilla war, which the British backed as well against him, which took a lot of forces from Napoleon. He's starting to have multiple fronts he's fighting. And then, of course, I'll get to the big thing in 1812. As you know, Napoleon decides to invade Russia. It was really his downfall, as you know. What happened to Hitler invading the Soviet Union, Russia same thing Napoleon did as well. There's a lot of ironies about that, but both those end up, causing the downfall of both those men and their states, of course, later. So we'll talk about, later in the week on Thursday. I'll kind of get into the fall of Napoleon's empire, how it collapses in Europe. I'll talk about his exiles that he, of course, has, of course, later. Then I'm going to probably get into like the post-Napoleon Europe and kind of probably have some time maybe to kind of also talk about what happened after they got rid of Napoleon around 1814, 1815. So that's it for today. I don't know if anybody had any questions. I don't think anybody did today. It looks like it, but don't forget, if you have any comments, questions about these lectures, of course, I do every week for our classes. Go ahead and have a comment, question. Send me something, about something. Remember, you get bonus for that. Any kind of students, of course. So I'll have that second part. I'll talk about, like I said, on Thursday. Likely, I'm going to have some kind of assignment coming up, probably, like I said, on the Napoleonic Wars, like a documentary that I'll have and like a little quiz on it. So I'll kind of talk about that later on Thursday. And maybe I'll kind of will maybe go into and discuss a little bit more into the upcoming second exam, what I think I might have on it, more or less. But don't forget, you do have that assignment that's due later in the week, at the end of the week, which is that Canvas quiz number 5, which is on the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution. So don't forget about that. I'll keep sending out reminders, but I know we have this week and next week, and then I think we have spring break that's, of course, coming up. So y'all take care. Hope y'all have a good rest of the week overall. And I'll see you like later in the week. So y'all take care. Okay.